Hello and welcome to Art Show. I'm Craig Stover, and today I have with me Sarah Sutton. Hey, Sarah, how are you today?
Good. How are you, Craig?
Very good. Very well. Thank you very much. I wanted to start by sharing some works of yours, give people at home an opportunity to see what the kind of work you do. So you did send me some stuff, but I also went online to see some stuff, and I really wanted to start out with this particular picture. I love this one. This one is really it's working for me. Can you tell me a little bit about this?
Well, first of all, this is a zoom into a larger painting, and the larger painting is titled West Valley, and it's
Okay.
about, I think it's 48 by 78 inches. So this little segment is probably about, I would guess, about 18 by 24
Oh,
inches.
I didn't realize. I thought it was its own picture. Okay, now I have to go back and get the original one. I'm sorry about that.
That's
So,
okay.
so in this particular picture, I'm looking at a lot of different things. All right. So I guess my first question to you is, where does your source materials come from?
This particular piece centers on a location, which most of my works do.
Okay.
Uh, and this is West Valley, New York. And it's a site that's 35 miles from Buffalo.
Mhm.
And it was a nuclear energy reprocessing plant in the 60s.
Mhm.
Um, so my research centers on all kinds of collecting and archiving, whether that's, I watched YouTube videos. I got, there's an original painted reference to an original photo of the factory in the 60s, which you can see a little bit in the background, the cars.
Mhm.
Uh, the creek that is one of the drain off channels to this location is also referenced, and that's the hand of someone holding a fish.
Mhm.
Um, so the plant was open just for 2 years, and it was the only private nuclear reprocessing plant in the history of the U.S.
Mhm.
And so, because it was profit based, I don't know if that's why, or if it's because it was, really before the EPA
Mhm.
had a bigger influence. But this was it is to this day extremely polluted. So this
Mhm.
painting starts with that site.
Mhm.
But then I'm basically collecting piles and piles of images, and I put them all together and kind of figure out how they can turn into one image, or, kind of
Mhm.
squeeze them
Mhm.
into one frame, which is a challenge. And it's interesting that you picked a piece that's only a part, because especially digitally, my work, and especially on Instagram, my work is really hard to view
Are
because there's so much happening.
so are you putting all of this together in a Photoshop program and then producing it?
I have multiple processing
Okay.
tools. Photoshop is definitely one of them. I use AI training programs where I upload all my images and see what the processing, what happens there and what type
Mhm.
of weird combinations I get. I have this model stand. I don't know if you spotted it on my site, but it's basically an analog Photoshop where I have all these layers. I designed it of
Mhm.
plexiglass. So I'll do a printout, sometimes paint blobs,
Mhm.
sometimes parts of if it's a small enough painting, we'll actually go under one of those layers and
Mhm.
I'll photograph it from the top.
Okay.
Um, I also use a lot of just plain old drawing and collage. So it's a
Mhm.
process of multiple steps.
Yeah, one of the things I was really intrigued about is the breadth of your work. So, I think a lot of people wouldn't even assume that it's the same artist in some of the works because, people, art education is terrible. But the idea that you're using so many different source materials within your work and then changing it up, to me, that was rather exciting to see. And I chose this one because I know you have some of these as actual 3Ds, but then this is a painted version of a 3D model that you made. Am I correct
Yeah.
in that?
I would
Okay.
say this was the earlier version of my current work, and it was based on, I called them dimensional collages.
Hmm.
I would collect, there's some, obviously images from, magazines and whatnot, but also painted papers. There's a little bit of roof asphalt down here at the bottom. So all these things that I would then sometimes coat with, shiny polymers, and then I would crumple them all up, kind of like a Chamberlain
Hmm.
sculpture, and paint them, from that kind of 3D model.
Are you
Um,
painting from the actual model, or are you photographing the model and then using the photograph to paint?
Both
Okay.
typically. Yeah. I because I am a really slow painter, these are actually done with grayscale first and then glazed over. There definitely photos were used, but it was set up the entire time
Was
as a
this, is this reference, uh, the reference history in something like this, is it similar to the first piece that we showed where each piece has a history to it and you're combining them?
This work, I consider this loosely figurative, where
Okay.
I don't know if you can see, but there's a crunched up hand, in the kind of middle left. And there's a face in the middle top. There's some
Okay.
fingernails in there. So, for me, it was very much, and the format's different, right? Because my other work, we don't see in that zoomed in shot, but typically it's landscape format, and these were very much, vertical. So these to me had, loosely a figurative bend.
Mm-hmm.
That crumpling of the papers and whatnot
This
was,
one.
that's has definitely that's still there.
So
That kind
that's,
of,
this is a sample of one of those, right?
yeah, yeah.
Okay. And what size are we looking at here? Oh,
Oh, these are small because they
okay.
were kind of in scale to magazine, ephemera,
Okay.
uh, found images. So they're about, I mean, I think they end up getting up to about 2 feet, but they're pretty small. I didn't do any extra printing to enlarge them.
Only because I've done work using objects like this. I can imagine that you may have the same problem I did. It's the lighting on something like this often gets tricky because of the shadows that it casts, really throws the piece. Did
I
you
mean, I
find
was
that?
super interested in that, I remember thinking of it as like a shallow depth,
Hmm.
and capturing that. I think that's really exciting, but in terms of painting from life with something so detailed, it's, very tricky. You definitely need to pick a lighting condition and stick with that.
It's interesting that you mentioned Chamberlain. So because that I saw that right away when I was looking through these, but I was wondering how much you were thinking about him. It's quite fascinating that you even brought him up. Have, with these particular pieces, are they all of that scale, or have you ever made some that were larger, or maybe made some in other materials like aluminums or something?
This honestly for me was kind of a means to an end. So this work is from 2010. I
Okay.
was telling you when we briefly emailed that, I love how you have people's older works and they're always surprised when they see them. And I thought, gosh, I don't have really old work, but I'm realizing it's 2024. So
Right.
most
Yeah.
people, especially younger people, this is a long time ago. Uh,
Yeah.
but no, I was really excited by this work, but I really didn't, I don't know how to explain it. I did not push it, to its full potential before I really found something I was more excited about.
Yeah.
Uh, and I have seen works in the past, in the time that's passed since these that do that, that are prints that are larger, that, are still
Yeah.
kind of folded. But yeah, I don't think that's where I was headed.
Speaking of heading, I really wanted to show this piece because I thought this was a wonderful. I love really good draftsmanship, and the idea that this has so much going on in it. I have too many questions, so can you just tell me a little bit about this?
So the drawings are typically, like I said, part of the process of
Right.
compression. So when you have, 100 images going into one composite painting, It's like there's so many exercises to figure out how they're going to combine. And I use perspective usually to collapse one space into the next.
Mm-hmm.
And that honestly drives me now. That's a huge interest to me, and creating a deeper space than I was in that early abstract figurative work. But the idea of giving, flat images a kind of gesture, whether it's a symbol or a rough drawing, adding the hand to, our kind of digital reference is still of interest. So in this, it was just, kind of a beginning phase of compressing a ton of images where I was really, my work, comes off as very dystopic. So in this image, I started to collect, what would it look like if there was a rebuilding? I think this was right after COVID or during COVID. Down here, bottom right, there's two figures. That's my daughter and her friend.
Okay.
And I took them to a hike, and they were drawing the trees and, all the flora. And I thought it like so inspiring. And so, I thought about in this ruin, there's also this, rebuild going on. So this was really my first piece where I tried to imagine that kind of rebuilding from the pieces, I guess.
Is this done with ink wash?
No, this is just graphite, and
Just graphite? Okay.
blending stick,
And then once you've done this piece, is this the final version and you've moved on, or do you still take this and then incorporate it into something else?
Well, this became a larger painting that was a total failure.
Yay!
Yeah, woohoo! This whole idea of I had this I don't know, just was taking a slightly different narrative in my work, and I was trying to add limited color, and it was just way too much. I had gotten into to Yotto, an artist residency that I really respected, and I was so pumped. And I did all these drawings, and I was ready to pull the color out again because my work had been grayscale for a while, and it was a total failure. So this, all the work I did there the entire time. It was a valuable failure, but was terrible.
That's why I cheer it, because I myself learn more from my failures than the successes.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but if the painting seems to go really easy, it's a disaster. Yeah. I need the struggle. I need to have something that is not working for me. I want to ask you about, because you had mentioned, especially within the first piece, about using so many reference items together to create new imagery. I want to talk to you about your relationship with your viewers, right? The people who look at your artwork. So are you expecting your viewers to walk away from your work with something specific in mind?
Well, if I do have a specific goal, which I guess, I do, it is to change. This sounds really ambitious, but bear with me. We all have lofty ideas, right? Not saying it's likely happening.
You sound like an artist. I got it. Go ahead.
My goal is sincerely to basically jumble up the visual grammar that we're used to seeing. So I taught painting and 2D design for years. So, we all know about, probably everyone watching this knows about Gestalt principles. So we see the figure over the ground, and we're constantly shifting and looking for that. And it keeps things really nice and neat. And I believe that way of seeing is a grammar that affects how we think. And it makes it very difficult to understand complex relationships that are kind of multifaceted and happen over long expanses of time, but are still sometimes causal and relational. So I hope that at minimum, when someone looks at my work, they kind of get lost in these spaces that are collapsing into each other, and they're not supposed to go together. And so the viewer can just has to kind of piece it together. I don't really care what they piece together, except that their visual perception is challenged, and that they enter this kind of slower viewing.
Yeah.
And again, it is hard to capture over like a tiny Instagram image, but in person, I
Oh yeah.
do think that does happen. Yeah.
When I was looking at your work, it's like this month I've talked to a couple of artists, and we're all actually talking about. There's several artists that are talking about that, about taking, what happens when you take two different images and put them together, not just in a diptych, but merge them together. And the artist that I keep raising is David Sally, the way
Yeah.
he takes his imagery to create new storylines, and they almost seem disjoined, but they are together as well.
Mhm.
But I think you're sort of one-upping that, is how I see it, because of some of these storylines that you have going together. They're together, but it's the way you're putting them together. You're not making it clarity within it. And I think that's fun. That's
Yeah.
great for the viewer to let them use their own imagination, or to let the viewers absorb, and because they're already bringing their own baggage anyway. And
Right.
so to play with that, I think it's really fun. I'm really excited to see that you're doing that. Let's
Can I add one more thing?
Sure.
Uh, just that, I think that the way that we view images now, because I'm of the generation that really was on the precipice of analog and digital, and
Mhm.
so it is very, I guess, I'm very conscious of the fact that we're really viewing images in a time-based way now.
Mhm.
So I think of myself as sampling images almost like you would sample sounds,
Mhm.
it's
Mhm.
almost like a film process where
Yeah.
I'm reading, but not necessarily left to right, but in every direction across the canvas.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I spoke to another artist, and his pictures for me got almost to the point where they're so too confusing. And I mentioned him. I think he needed some sort of a codex, some sort of a way to let people in, because he just
Yeah.
got tighter and tighter as he went along. Anyway, I want to start at the beginning, because I find that this next question I have for you is always an interesting insight on artists. I want to ask you about your childhood, and in
Mhm.
particular, do you have a moment where you were exposed to art like as a first time, and it sort of like it left a huge impression on you or blew you away?
I've heard you ask this, so I'm not
Mhm.
gonna lie. I've been thinking about it, and
Okay.
I think for me, it wasn't until I was a little bit older, like maybe middle school.
Yeah.
I remember I lived in the Cleveland area at this time. I grew up in Northeastern PA, and I was exposed to no art there.
Mhm.
And then between eighth and ninth grade, moved to Ohio. So I do vividly remember seeing the Van Gogh pieces at the
Mm.
Cleveland Museum of Art, and just being like, felt like I'm seeing this painting, but I'm getting so much more sensory information from it than, I could ever imagine, and energy, and, just kind
Mm.
of being blown away by that.
Was
And
it the
then
motion or the color, or both?
I both, yeah, the
Okay.
mark, which I think, it's really weird to compare myself, and talk about that as an influence, but the way
No,
that
no.
marks are broken up and the
Hmm.
density, I think I can relate to.
Yeah,
Um,
no, I can see it. I see it in your mark making,
yeah, but
especially in the drawings, which is why I was asking about it.
yeah.
They're lively, there's movement, but you have something else that he doesn't
And
have.
I don't really, this is taboo with painters, but I don't really live in the sensory, like, color realm. I'm definitely
Hmm.
more of a kind of intellectual idea painter than, not really at least right now, the work really
Right.
operates through composition and mark, and
Is
not
that
so
why you had trouble with that failed painting, maybe?
yeah, it was. No, the color, because I'm balancing so much that the color creates its own hierarchy and
Yeah,
mood. I can't
yeah,
have that in this particular body of work. Yeah, it
yeah.
just breaks apart.
Have you
And
ever worked in monochrome then? Like not just black and white, but just say like red and white or blue and white or something like that?
I have. I've honestly tried it all within
Okay.
this formula. So, but yeah, I come back to the grays, but I do have several temperatures I work with that get lost in photos, but in person you do see that. Yeah.
So you had mentioned, we talked about source materials. So how giant is your box of source materials? Like, are you constantly, like, every day, are you picking up stuff? And putting it in the pile?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
and also digitally. So I
digital.
have just, folder after folder of imagery and
Do you print
some
everything out
what's
then?
that?
Do you print everything out that you find
Yeah, I was
digitally?
gonna say a lot of, not all of it. I mean, I have way more than I need, and I
Right.
collect kind of database folders.
Yeah.
So I'll be on a topic and kind of know it needs a little bit of this or that, and I have the folder names are hilarious and kind of embarrassing, but like fires and like I don't
Right.
know, it's like industrial disasters. And so I kind of curate it together. And then depending on what I'm using, I often then print out a lot of images. I have just a grayscale printer, and that's all I need right now. And I
Yeah.
crunch them up, and then I start to really play with them. And
Would
yeah.
you ever show your source materials in an exhibition along with your work?
Oh yeah. I mean,
You've
when
done
I
that?
have to say, when I use the AI training program, I end up putting all of it, even if it's scanned paint blobs, which I
Yeah.
use a lot. I end up putting it all in one folder, which can be 150 images, and
Yeah.
dump them into there. So I have, just that I started using that as a tool. It's been really interesting to see how many images, like to really quantify that. So
Hmm.
yeah, I totally would. I don't know if it's practical though.
Well, I've curated exhibitions like that where I'll reproduce, artists' studio walls, and I find audiences are fascinated to find out
Yeah.
like all those little references and what's going on. So it leaves me the question I first had when I showed that snippet of a painting of yours is when somebody ends up owning a piece of yours, do they ever walk away not knowing anything about it, or do you always try to make sure they know the storyline behind it?
Usually the titles tell the story, and
Okay.
everyone, these days Googles. So, like I
Okay.
have a painting that's pretty abstract, and um it's called Imperial Sugar, and it's about a sugar factory explosion loosely. I mean, again,
Hmm.
I'm not, I
That's
consider
the
myself kind of,
springboard.
yeah, conceptually narrative. It's not really, like a linear story.
Hmm.
But I do think there's a way to kind of access the layers.
Hmm.
Also, I think that some of the work is fairly photorealistically painted, so you can also use, which I think is interesting, that Google image capture. It usually won't. I mean, they're usually distorted enough, but I often
Right.
like check that. It's kind of interesting.
Wow. Hey, that's $1 million app idea to,
I know.
point yourself. It's oh, okay, that's where it's from.
So I guess I think that they do kind of beg the viewer to like figure it out a little
Yeah,
bit. So
yeah,
will they know exactly? I don't know that I know exactly, but they'll get parts of it.
yeah. So your work has obviously changed over the years. I question I like to ask is, have you seen it as a progression in the change, or have there been times when you've done like, all right, I'm going to do something radically different at this point? Have you ever done
Um,
that? Or
I do that all the time, and then
okay,
I get really, I like to keep making it, I think it's a common issue that people, artists have, who have been making work for over 20 years, is like, I don't want to lose the risk taking, but I've worked so hard to get to this work that I know feels right, and it's still challenging me.
yeah.
But every couple months, I start a whole new series, and then I'm like, what am I doing? Like, I'm spending, I don't even like this. I have
But the
limited time.
payoff comes at the end.
Yeah, but I do try to do that. Like
Yeah.
I think it's healthy, and I can't resist. Like that's just kind of my
Do
curiosity.
your series ever overlap, or are you one series at a time kind of?
I would say they overlap. Yeah, I have some of the grayscale work that figures, that there's a kind of big scrunched up figure hidden in there. They definitely overlap, and the color work I'm doing now is really different. I think it does overlap, but it's a little. I don't think you saw any of those, but
Do you
yeah,
ever put
not.
anything to bed? Like, all right, I'm done with this series.
Oh,
Or do
all the
they always come back?
No, all the time. They hardly. I'm onto a series now that's shows promise, and it overlaps, but it's different. So I don't know what'll happen with that one, but I'm not putting that to rest. It kind of seems like it can live alongside of what I'm doing.
Uh, one of the things I was curious about, because you have so many reference materials, this is kind of a two-parter. One is, do you ever find yourself over time, like older work, do you ever like destroy older work?
Oh yeah.
Okay, all right. So,
I'm yeah, a fan of throwing things away.
okay.
I
Part
mean, or
two of that question is if you're going to throw something away, have you ever said, well, I like these ideas within it, so then you keep those, but you throw the item away? Have you ever done that?
um
Like recycling old imagery or something?
oh, all the time. Yeah, I
Okay.
have a couple, I did a lot of dioramas of, sounds boring, but paint. And I've been using those images that I took, 20 years ago, throughout. Like when I need a form to kind of melt into another form, that's kind of a imagery I go back to. But yeah, I am known to throw out paintings too quickly and then be like, oh no. I wish I had that. There's one I've been thinking about for 20 years that one woman friend of mine, she said that was the best painting you
Oh
ever
yeah,
did.
yeah.
And I still think about it. But
Could you repaint it? Are you that kind of an artist?
no, I can't. It's like it was the beginning of these series and it was more of a monochrome, but it just had a different mood to it and different
Yeah.
ways I was using that are really they don't work that when I try to reimagine them. So I wish I still had it.
um, I want to ask you a moment about the scale of your work, because I've seen tiny pieces and I've seen really large pieces, and I know sometimes the scale of the work can influence, just even the movement, the shape of that your hand is going to make those marks. Yeah. Do you have a preference?
That's a great question. It's something I think about a lot, and I do think
Okay.
about that more than the content in relation to the viewer because I'm really trying to engage with the viewer's perception. So I vary it basically, and within the same painting there could be super tight tiny marks and then really big loose marks. So I always think about the idea of choreographing the viewer, like are they close up, are they further back, and in
Right,
this
right.
I like to have the huge piece next to the tiny,
The
my
tiny piece.
one, and I can't do that anymore. My eyes are failing me, but close up, but the 6 by 6 inches. Then the viewer is getting like literally their nose is almost in that painting.
Yeah.
Um, but the counter side to that is, I think about the viewer, but I'm working on a large painting right now with the densest, tiniest marks I've ever painted, and it is so challenging. Like I feel that perceptual challenge, as I'm like my body is like cramping up. I'm like, what am I
Yeah.
doing? Like
Yeah.
it's so weird. And
Well, you're really, I can understand that, because it's two different ways of talking to other people, your audiences. Small works is a intimate one-on-one conversation, and big works you're shouting across the room. But it sounds
yeah,
to me like you're doing both now. Like you're making
yeah,
big works, but you're forcing the viewer to
I
come up
know.
close. I can see why that's a challenge to create, and could be very frustrating. Um, Time for just one more question. Big question. What does art mean to you?
Well, I think that for me, I mean, I've heard a lot of great answers to this from your previous guests, but just thinking about,
Not what it
for
does for you. What does it mean to you?
oh, okay, what does it mean to me?
What
My
does
art
art mean?
or any art?
Your art.
Okay. I think that for me, it's a way of interpreting. This sounds generic, but I feel like a lot of the apparatus of our daily life is hidden. Like we go
Okay.
about our life and we, are entertained and we buy things, but a lot of the real things we don't really see. So I like to imagine I have like an X-ray vision where I can see all the mechanisms and the real thing, what I consider the real things. So for me, that's just keeps me creative and engaged and
Hmm.
like kind of the world is a constant mystery and curiosity which I enjoy.
Hmm. Are you constantly looking at artwork, like every day?
pretty much. I mean, you know, I also do some uh, some eco native plant restoration work. So
Okay.
I look at plants and art, but yeah, every day I look at art, I would say, yeah.
So it kind of combines maybe. Okay.
Definitely.
All right. Well, it's fascinating because now I have a lot more questions than I had to begin with. So, but Sarah, I want to thank you so much for coming by and talking with me today about your work. Big fan, and I look forward to actually seeing it in person. I
Thank
also
you.
want to thank everybody who tuned into Art Show today. We really appreciate your support. Of course, liking and subscribing really helps Art Show. We're trying to get to that next level. So thank you again for watching. And again, Sarah, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Craig. It was fun.
Take care, everyone.